As I mentioned previously, I've been looking forward to Professor Wilson joining us for actually since last spring, I think, when we were first in touch, and you justly agreed to join us, albeit virtually. Of course, we thought it might be in person, and we'll just have to find another opportunity to invite you down for that. So as people are joining, I think the school community is pretty familiar with our webinar format thus far. Joining me in the space with Professor Wilson are Peter Wong and Kadi Zhang, who are they're both the coordinators and master planners of our 50th anniversary lecture series and colloquium series, and also hard at work with Chris Jarrett on our symposium, which is coming up in March 24th through 26th. And also joining me, Emily Makash and Greg Snyder, who will be in the space discussing or kind of prompting questions and answers after Professor Wilson's lecture with the students, Jess, Masai, and Jasir. And Greer Friedrich, the Uber executive assistant and heart and soul of the School of Architecture here, moderating. So thank you, Greer. And just as a way to get us started, without much more delay, I wanted to suggest that anyone who hasn't seen it yet, stop by the Lambla Gallery if you're in Storrs Hall or near campus, because Say It Loud, North Carolina is installed. It is gorgeous. It is an incredible, inspiring show. We had planned to welcome Professor Wilson here for her lecture, have the opening and welcome Pascal Sablon here in town. This day was going to be incredible. It'll still be great, but we'll have some details. Stay tuned for more details. We're still hoping that Pascal can join us. It looks like early March, fingers crossed, and then we can have an opening, kind of a wrap up, if you will, of the show then. But please do stop by. It is a stunning show, and there's so much to be proud of. So with that, I will hand things off to Peter or Kadi for introductions.
Great. Very good. Thank you, Blaine. And welcome everybody to our second spring lecture that celebrates our 50th anniversary year. Just a few words first about Mabel to introduce her. She is the Nancy and George E. Rupp Professor in Architecture at Columbia University in New York, where she also is a professor in African American and African Diaspora Studies. At Columbia, she serves as director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies and co-directs Global Africa Lab. She received her PhD in American Studies at NYU and design degrees from Columbia and University of Virginia. She is the author of Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Negro Building, African Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums. She's currently working on her third text, Building Race and Nation, Slavery and Disposition's Influence on American Civic Architecture. She has also co-edited with Irene Chang and Charles Davis the book Race and Modern Architecture from the Enlightenment to Today. Her practice, Studio And, is structured around a collaborative team who engages cross-disciplinary themes of design, blackness, and race. The office recently completed the memorial to enslaved African American laborers at the University of Virginia, as well as co-curated last year's exhibit, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at the Museum of Modern Art. She is also the founding member of Who Builds Your Architecture, a collective that advocates for fair labor practices on building sites worldwide. As a dedication, Professor Wilson will address us today from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, original to the Catawba, Waxhaw, Chirrahua, and Sirgagri people before settlers, immigrants, and descendants of those forcibly brought here were present, making it important for us to remember that we are here because this land was occupied. Professor Wilson, thank you for joining us for this 50th anniversary lecture at the School of Architecture today.
Great, thank you, Peter, for that generous introduction, and thank you for mentioning WBYA, because that's been an important advocacy project that I've worked with a really dedicated group of folks. So, and I just want to thank Blaine for the invitation to come, Jessica, Masay, and Jasir for being interlocutors today. Also, Caddy, for all your work. I want to and thank Greer for all the work that she's done and kind of making at least the virtual lecture possible. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I haven't been in Charlotte actually probably about 25 years, so it's been a while. And it's funny, my family's actually from Eastern North Carolina, so I've spent a lot of time in the Carolinas. So it would have been fun to be in Charlotte, but you know, hopefully sometime in the future, you know, and I'm really excited that you're going to have Pascal as well. So that should be really exciting in March. So I'm going to get started, and let me do the screen share. Hopefully all will work out okay and this won't go haywire. Great, can you all see the screen? For some reason I can no longer see you all.
We can see it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's fine if I don't see you, because actually then it allows me to actually see all my notes. Yeah, but for some reason this time when I went full screen, I lost the Zoom link. So anyway, I just want to start by saying, as Peter also acknowledged, I am in New York, and I am actually speaking from the traditional land and unceded territory of the Lenape, the Lenni Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora in honor of the past, present, and most importantly, the future presence of the Lenape on their homeland. So let's go. So I'm actually going to talk about my practice, which is something I haven't really talked about much. I will sometimes talk about individual projects. I have often been talking about sometimes more scholarly work, writings that I've done, or specific projects. But I wanted to maybe talk about the nature of Studio And. So I began the practice in 2007. And this is after having a practice with a partner, Paul Kariuk, who I'll talk about some of our collaboration, KWA, for a number of years. And I chose the ampersand and as a sign that my practice was both collaborative, as in and other people, as well as transdisciplinary, as in and other disciplines. And so the work that I do navigates between written works, architectural projects, installations, performances, and as of late, curatorial projects. So this early diagram of my practice sort of illustrates the critical research and how it finds expression in one form that leads to a parallel project and another creative modality. So on the left, you sort of see a kind of timeline of writings, like the book Negro Building, for example. And then on the right, you actually see how that then translates into different projects on the right. So for example, Negro Building actually led to, I submitted, I was a finalist for the competition for the National African American Museum of History and Culture. I collaborated with Diller Scofidio Renfro. And so, that was a design project. They eventually approached me to actually do the book because they knew I understood it both as an architect and as a historian through Negro building. So I've kind of had, this practice that kind of works between sort of scholarly research, design research, and also built work for a number of years. And so I wanted to maybe share, especially since I know there are students out there and they're thinking about questions of practice, the methodologies I use. And part of that reason I choose to do that methodology is because I wanted to better understand this thing called blackness, and what that means, but also understand race. And what does that mean toward the built environment and also specifically architecture? So I wanted to start with my architectural education. So at both the undergraduate level, I went to the University of Virginia, and that's part of my connection to UVA. And I also did my MArch at GSAT, which is where I am now. Somehow I just seem to always return, I think, to the schools where I went. I recognized in my work that in order to draw blackness into architectural discourse, and to make visible anti-Black racism in the built realm, that I really needed to cut across boundaries of the discipline. And I did this by turning oftentimes elsewhere. I looked at art, I looked at, especially in the 90s, what was emerging as critical race theory. I looked to Black studies, to poetry, and to literature. And early on, it really was, interestingly enough, the work of Toni Morrison that provided critical methods and deep theoretical frameworks for my own practice. And so this is a quote from Black Matters, her essay. And I just found it incredibly useful in terms of how to think about a method of work. And so I substituted her term as a writer of the English language for the term architecture. And so my effort to manipulate architecture was not to take standard architecture and use the vernacular to decorate or to paint over it, but to carve away at its accretions of deceit, blindness, ignorance, paralysis, and sheer malevolence, so that certain kinds of perceptions were not only available, but were inevitable. Now, in Morrison's nonfiction's work, which is something I looked at very early on when I kind of started to write more historical and theoretical works, her book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, I began to understand that it was important to reckon with the ways that Western body of knowledge, particularly literally its ways of knowing and being, its episteme and ontology, constructed a framework, a set of signifiers and meanings around whiteness. And it has made it provisional, if not impossible, for the African, along with what I'm calling the African blackened in the whole, to become the Negro, the New World Negro, to obtain something called a historical consciousness. This is important. Historical consciousness is important for being a modern subject. This modern subject in formation is the formation that the West imagined as being modern, right? And in this way, blackness then is consigned to the past, marked as primitive, to the savage, to the not modern. But it is wholly necessary, as Morrison writes in Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, to give definition and depth to whiteness. That relegation to being on the threshold of being modern, awaiting development, is, as many have written, a completely misreading of what it means to be modern. So like Toni Morrison, the poet Norbesi Phillips also recognizes these traps in the West's discourse of history and poetry and literature, and I add to that architecture. Now, Norbesi Phillips distrusts the languages of documents and policies. She's actually trained as a lawyer who writes and works and and writes poetry. But she doesn't trust that kind of language of the historical precedent of the legal document. And she is wary of the language of being in history that can't account for things like what was called the Zone Massacre, when in 1781, hundreds, probably 200, 250, enslaved people were tossed overboard from on a ship that was sailing from, I believe it was Gambia to Jamaica, and they lost their way. And so they were running out of water, they were running out of food. And so they simply said, okay, this is cargo we cannot take care of. And so they literally tossed over 200 people. Now, when they returned to the metropole of London, the slave traders attempted to collect payment for their lost cargo because the cargo was insured, right? And so these were humans that were turned into property on account ledgers and court proceedings, right? And so what Philip writes about the court proceeding, which is the basis of her poetry in Zong, she looks at that violence that's in that court proceeding. It's just a 2-page document. It's the only evidence we have of this court case. And she writes, quote, that the language in which these events took place promulgated the non-being of African peoples. And I distrust its order, which hides disorder, its logic, hiding illogic, and its rationality, which is simultaneously irrational, end quote, right? So she's talking about like a legal record of a court case, right? And all of its kind of regal splendor of argumentation, right? But what is modern architecture if not dedicated to order, logic, and rationality? But can architecture also be hiding disorder, illogic, and irrationality that is that double bind of modernity, right? As we see here in this painting of the early republic, of this juxtaposition of liberty and slavery. And I used to use this painting in a class I taught to BArch students on urban form, and I taught the Americas, right? The early American architecture, particularly Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. And it was a painting by Samuel Jennings, who's English. He sent it to the U.S. in 1892 to hang in what was called the Library Company. That was one of the first libraries, public libraries in the United States that had been founded by Ben Franklin, probably around the 1750s or so. And it was a company because people gave money, and with that money they sent for books. And it was a very important collection of books because it was used when the founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence. That was the collection of books, for example, that Jefferson used, right, to refer to Rousseau and all of these people who were influencing how they were thinking about those documents. Also used in the Continental Congresses, thinking about like, all right, how do we govern the United States, eventually write the Constitution, right? So it's a very important collection. So Jennings sends this over as a kind of early indication of the need to abolish slavery. And what I've always found interesting is that line that's drawn between the realm of nature and the realm of civilized reason, knowledge. And we see Liberty with her Frisian cap here, which means she has been freed. Her hand is on a book of philosophy and agriculture, and around her are the accoutrements, right, of knowledge, of music, of painting, antiquity. We see the column capital, astronomy, mechanics, heraldry, right? And she, Cleo, who is wisdom, is freeing, enslaved Africans, right? And they're grateful, they're bowed. But notice on their side, they are kind of in that realm of nature, except the one that, who's deferent, and you see his head in the grid, right? So there's this world of logic and order, and then there's that realm of nature, and the enslaved group is around also a liberty pole, right? And the ships in the background apparently are symbolizing this return to Africa. The bust is supposedly Granville Sharp, who founded Sierra Leone to repatriate Africans in the New World and also in Europe to settle basically the African continent, right? So it's a very, very complex allegory, right, of liberty and the end of slavery, but also meaning that the Americans have thrown off their chains of enslavement, right, to the British royalty. So what I'm interested in my wider body of work in both design and I would say the scholarly work is to think about how the discourse of architecture, its representational tools, how its histories are written, its dependency and allyship with state power and racial capitalism, its technologies and its aesthetics are knotted with this double bind of racialized thinking, representation, and practices. So that's what I kind of want to talk about today in my talk. And so in response to this double bind, really for over the past 30 years, I've engaged in what I call a Black study. one that allows me to make visible my own history and to bring Black cultural practices and sensibilities into the making of the built world. This is an ethos of dialogue and collaboration that frames my practice, Studio and I've explored recurring themes of home places, rememory and mobility, and unbuilding race. So this is what I want to share with you today. Home places. So I wanted to maybe start with my own education. So my last studio at GSAP, where I did my MArch, which is still called Studio 6, I was taught by Stan Allen, who eventually left GSAP and he became the dean actually at Princeton. And what Stan asked us to do was to unpack the single family American suburban house through techniques of collage. Now, I chose to unpack the latent Blackness and invisible forces of anti-Black racism, right? And thinking about, this kind of question of a single family American suburban house, in fact, I grew up in a little white house, one of these suburban houses in coastal New Jersey in the 1960s, which is seen here. And in fact, my father designed the house and was built by a local builder. So in that home where I grew up, my entree into the world of languages and ideas was through a book called Before We Read. And these are a couple of the images of that book, whose pictures here shown not only reinforced gender roles, right? I mean, like you could see, like these images are teaching, at the time, like, little Jane, is in the kitchen like mommy, right, doing housework, and here's Dick, relaxing with dad, right, before TV. So it shows how these images are reinforcing certain identities, right? But also the ways in which whiteness is normalized, not only by words, but also in images, right? This common Dick and Jane primer series reinforced that before we read words, we decode the world through images. And clearly, neither words or images are neutral. Now, for my Studio 6 project, I unpacked Toni Morrison's epigraph to her novel, The Bluest Eye, where she carves away at this type of iconic Dick and Jane primer. I actually, just as an aside, went to an amazing exhibition at David Zwirner Gallery yesterday, curated by Hilton Als, the writer for The New Yorker, on Toni Morrison's work. And in that was a copy of a note on the manuscript around why she used this primer. And it absolutely affirms the way in which I understood her to mean it. So it was an amazing, almost kind of validation of how I had used it so many years ago. Now note, this is scanned from the original book that I had. And so note how that first paragraph to the left introduces the single family house of the suburb, right? Here is the house. Its generic colors, it's green and white, its entry, and the family that resides there. And notice how it teaches us reading through forms of identification, types of sociality, what is aesthetically pleasing, various affective responses, right? So this is making learning to read possible by using this example. Now in the second paragraph, Morrison plays with these rules of grammar, which its structures have been removed, like capitalization is gone, the period is gone. Now we can read the words, but without those pauses of capitalization and punctuation, it's more difficult. So as a consequence, meaning becomes more elusive. We don't know where to begin or end, right? So almost like meaning is kind of more floating. Now in the third paragraph, this is where Morrison carves away even more, because she removes the space between the words, right? And to me, that's a very architectural move. Now the string of letters makes the detection of words even more difficult, which makes reading difficult, which makes enunciation impossible. We cannot enter the text. We cannot breathe. The body cannot occupy the text. And in many ways, it evokes both the madness and silence that is going to be latent in The Bluest Eye. So in The Bluest Eye, Morrison tells the story of a Black girl, Pecola, who lives amidst an untold violence and suffering. Pecola, however, believes that if she only had blue eyes like her little doll, she would be beautiful and hence happy and safe. And in many ways, her insanity becomes a refuge, right? So what Morrison does becomes a kind of operational method for me on the found object, the primer, and a way to uncover the hidden powers and logics of representation and meaning, how whiteness and patriarchy orders meaning and space, even in language. And so I asked, can that operation be applied to the rational methods of architectural representation and drawing? Levittown became the site of operation, right, as to me, the kind of iconic single-family house. Now, a long history of white settler colonialism, which forged whiteness as property, as Scholar Harris writes, restrictive covenants and bank lending practices ensured that America's 20th century post-war federally financed suburbs would stay primarily white and primarily heteronormative.
Why did you select Levittown to live?
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white. We were very happy to buy a home here.
So looking at the plans and sections of that iconic Levittown house, I adapted that strategy of carving away to misread the spatial logics of the house through its representations, right? So this is where I turn to Black artists who've had a long history of working with found objects, right? Because my object was this house. And I looked at, for example, the assemblage art of Betty Saar, whose liberation of Aunt Jemima became a generative figure for a project that I eventually called The House for Grigri. So these were some of the drawings that I started to generate. And the drawings began to collage by collaging in these found images with the house. You know, I started to dissect it and find hidden below the stairs and between the walls and inside the cabinets and around the plumbing and under the floors and in the basement and inside the attics, representations of blackness. And these artifacts, the mask and Aunt Jemima and the charm, were the means to find them. And through this process that included reading the suburb and the city, where I drew the suburban houses of the South Bronx, Charlotte's Garden, these very strange suburban houses that were literally built in the South Bronx of New York City, I discovered what I call the House for Grigri, which was a talisman for domestic rituals and a container for the practices of Black life and domesticity. So for this early exploration of Blackness, I also drew on the familiar work of Los Angeles-based artist John Outerbridge, who passed away a little over a year ago. And so these are a couple of his works. He's a peer of Betty Saar, David Hammons, and you kind of can start to see how he sort of works with found objects and the ways in which they have a very, very, very material expression, but also, and sometimes in some of the work, a very architectural one, right? As you could see on this piece on the right. Now, Outerbridge, who is my mother's brother, he's my uncle, grew up in the Jim Crow South. He grew up in Greenville, North Carolina. Another White House, though a double shotgun house, this is the one seen here in Greenville, North Carolina. My mother and uncle actually grew up in a house nearby, but this is the home place that I remember. It's where my grandparents lived. My mother migrated with my father to New Jersey in the 1950s, and shortly thereafter, my Uncle Johnny migrated to Chicago and then Los Angeles, as did many of their generation, fleeing the oppressive racism of Southern segregation at the turn of the Civil Rights Movement. As they moved, they brought with them a rich culture of making things, of making a way out of no way. And as I have written, quote, "Home places can travel like people in packages. Any place you collect objects of remembrance, model ships and family photographs, or practice rituals of everyday life, like cooking fried fish from old recipes or making live soap, all of these things serve as spiritual entrees back to one's home place." Now, my Uncle Johnny eventually settled in Los Angeles in the 1960s and joined this cadre of artists like Noah Purifoy and others. And they made revolutionary artistic statements from things like the detritus of the Watts Rebellion in 1965. And so you see here a piece of my uncle's traditional hang-up, and on the right, what happened in Watts in 65. My Uncle John built full-scale installations that actually found beauty in blight. And so this is from his series of the aesthetics of urban blight, right? And so this is a public art installation in downtown Pasadena. And so you could see the scale of these kind of large, corten steel panels, that are, rusted away, and then the ways in which bits and pieces of rag, my uncle referred to himself often as a rag man, were found in these pieces. Now, with architect and photographer Peter Tolkien, he actually has a practice, Tolo in LA. Back in the mid-90s, we spent a day talking with my Uncle Johnny about how he not only made art out of everyday life, but that he also made architecture. He was a painter, he was a photographer, and he was a blues flautist. And he found art in many things. And so that day we shared the sweetness of grilled catfish while the soulful strains of John Coltrane drifted through his studio in South Central LA. And so that's why this photo essay piece that we did with him, it was part interview, was called Catfish and Coltrane. Conversations about making a home site. So this is one of Peter's photographs. A is for artists, door is for vintage VWs. Behind that garage door, the colors of red, blue, yellow mark the hazardous chemicals for making the art inside. This was the interior of his studio. Doors with holes, artworks on white walls, windows framed by the aesthetics of urban blight. So the ways in which he brought that art into his studio as part of a way of living. The fragments of rag on one side of the wall, right? And you could see this was like a rag on the cross from a piece that he did that was actually, I think, part of the Sao Paulo Biennale many years ago. So they're on one side of the wall in the gallery, but on the other side, literally, is a towel bar that carried rags for washing dishes. Here's another juxtaposition. The screws on his piece called In Search of the Missing Mule from 1993, and he uses that same technique, right, of the attachment, as screws mark a kind of asymmetric rhythm of connecting countertops, right, in the kitchen. So there's a way in which he's making the art, but he's making art out of the ways in which he's living. And so there's a kind of depth to that space, right? Deep space, like Sun Ra. And it's really an important way in which the legacy of his work has become a part of the ways in which I kind of think about, right, a kind of critical practice of making. So, over the long arc of the Great Migrations, thousands of Black Americans, like my parents and my Uncle Johnny, moved to and transformed the places to which they arrived. As my colleague, Farah Griffin, writes in her poignant exploration of migration narratives in her book, Who Set You Flowing, quote, after leaving the South, the next pivotal moment in the migration narrative is the initial confrontation with the urban landscape, usually experienced as a change in time, space, and technology, as well as a different concept of race relations. This results in a profound change in the ways in which the mechanisms of power work in the city. End quote. So in 1995, I began a partnership, KWA, with my UVA classmate, Paul Kariuk. One of our early projects was to explore these familial histories of migration. And we were interested in how migration as a force doesn't alter urban space in immediately apparent ways, and instead, these transformations occur often over time and begin within the confines of domestic space, right? So these aren't big changes, but small cumulative changes. And so we wanted to chart how these communities appear and disappear and thus fail to register as urban traces. And so we were thinking about my, family's history of migrations, sort of from the South, and his family had migrated from France, actually by way of Russia, and then to the US as immigrants in the 1930s and 40s. So as a full-scale installation, the Away Station examines the architectural spaces of urban migration. And so, as you see, we imagined on the left, a kitchen, a bedroom, a living room, and a bathroom, which are typically separate. But often for those who are in migrations, these domestic routines may occur in the same space, right? And so as you see on the right, like all of those things get collapsed into the same space. So the bed actually might be a place where you eat, or the bed becomes a space where you actually might write or work, right? And so this improvised domesticity emerges in a space that we call a way station, an away station. So drawing on these techniques of assemblage art, the away station collapses these spaces into a dense amalgam of objects that are brought into in transition. Furniture, clothing, sentimental objects are all packed in with newly acquired objects of consumer culture, as well as within, the things that were built. And, here I'm just showing some of our process and some of the things, the furniture built in, that's Paul in the white hat. And, we collaborated with an amazing, talented architect, Yusuke Ebuchi, who now teaches at the University of Tokyo. He ran the design research lab actually at the AA for a number of years. And so with Yusuke, we fabricated this amazing thing called the away station, and here are some of the details, right? So for these way stations, a hotel room, the residence of a friend or family member, perhaps a refugee center, is a point of transition before a return to their homeland for some, or a point of transition along a path, right, of adaptation to a new place, right? Things and memories are packed together into a dense milieu in which the rituals of everyday life unfold. Now, the away station, that map, that drawing, right, is literally sectionally cut, right, into 15 blocks. And these 15 blocks are towers, and they could be unpacked according to the space in which the away station inhabits and can adapt to the unpredictable circumstances of site. And so this is an installation that we did at the storefront for art and architecture in New York City, right? And so see here are the towers. They're actually illuminated on the interior, and then the drawings are actually on what we call the drawing table. So explaining, right, how to kind of read these installations. And recorded narratives also document the project's journey, so that as one moved through the away station, migration narratives are replayed describing journeys, processes of migration into the city where the project was exhibited. Right, and so you see here, some of the kinds of objects, and some of the objects become very familiar. Some are actually really defamiliarized as you look at it. So this is a kind of effective space and response that people have to their environments, right? And then as you're moving around, you're hearing migration narratives. So in New York, you hear the story of Jerry, who migrated from Haiti. You often also hear a different narrative of Jean-Uric, who also migrated from Haiti at a different time, both telling, what it meant to flee from the wrath of the Duvaliers. You also hear from Alan, an undocumented Filipino woman, and you hear about her aspirations. And we also included my father. I actually grew up very near New York City. So you hear why he left the segregated South in search of opportunities for his family up north. Here you see it at a space in San Francisco. And here the migration narratives were of a Colombian woman who had migrated from Peru, seeking independence for herself and her family. We also interviewed an elderly Chinese man, SoA, which was really remarkable. He left his homeland at age 4 to arrive in San Francisco in 1915. So he was in his 90s when we interviewed him. In LA, we interviewed my Uncle Johnny about his journey westward from North Carolina to Los Angeles by way of Chicago. So in these interim homes, these way stations, people establish domiciles that are situated between memories of homelands from which they may recently left or fled, and the imaginings and desires of the places they aspire to be. Rememory. So how do you build spaces for remembering. That's another Morrison's term, like membering together. So remembering, suturing together the past from archives and sites of slavery, which bear the traces of the physical, epistemic, and ontological violence of enslavement. Now, toward that task, my colleague, Saidiya Hartman, writes in her incredible essay, Venus in Two Acts. She writes that, quote, "I want to tell the story of two girls, capable of retrieving what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own act of narration. It is a story predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives, and intent on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produced numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, which is as close as we come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved," end quote, right? So she was literally trying to figure out, sort of like Norbesi Phillips in the archive, when you find the story of these two girls who are on a slave ship, and I think one died, again, her body is tossed overboard, how do we tell the story, but without committing violence and recognizing the violence of the archives, right, of the history of slavery? And so this is an important question. So when it opened in 1826, the universities of Virginia, right, and we see here the famous lawn, the 10 pavilions housed faculty and family. And in between those pavilions were the lawn rooms that boarded 125 white male students. And in the middle is that verdant swath of this terraced lawn that was crowned in the distance by the rotunda, which was the centerpiece of the ensemble that housed the library, right? And that is this, Platonic form based on the Pantheon. This was just a dream of the Enlightenment, right? So in his plans for the academical village, was what he called UVA, Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the second governor of Virginia, third president of the United States, but also at Monticello, he was a plantation owner, surveyor, and owner of 600 enslaved men, women, and children over the course of his life, brought together an exclusive community and an environment that he designed, as he wrote in a letter about the future of universities, that they should be a space conducive to health, to study, to manners, morals, and order, end quote. So again, that term order, right? Now, when I was an undergraduate architecture student at UVA, what was silent in the official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865 was mention of the academical village's dependency on 150 at one time enslaved people. And here we see an enslaved woman taking care of a white child of the professors at the end of Pavilion 9. That history hid in plain sight for 155 years, right? And here it is on this cartouche, this famous 1825 map of Virginia, and here is this depiction of enslavement at UVA. Now in 2016, I joined, back one. Here we go. So in 2016, I joined with architects Mi Jin Yoon and Eric Howler, Charlottesville landscape architect Greg Bleem, and UVA professor and conflict mediator and activist Frank Dukes to win the commission to design the memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA, which opened in the spring of 2020. And here, seen here at Montpellier with Frank on the right, is Brooklyn-based artist Etta Ochitigbe, who joined us a year later. For over 6 months, we engaged multiple communities from within the university and in Charlottesville. And what we heard from our dialogue with students and faculty and staff in the university community, but also with people in Charlottesville, was that, and alumni, that the memorial needed to tell the unvarnished truth about slavery in the past to have any legitimacy, that it needed to bring the community together to both learn and reflect on that history, and that it needed to express a complex duality, not only the pain and suffering of enslavement, but also the resilience, dignity, and the humanity of those who were enslaved. And lastly, it really needed to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of the commemorative landscape remains incomplete. It was important to convey that material presence, right, of Black lives at UVA, right? And you could see here this kind of the brick, right, and the ways in which the labor to make the 1.5 million bricks that built the rotunda, which was often done by enslaved boys, right? And in some of the bricks at the rotunda that you could see in an exhibition, you could see thumbprints, right? So it was important, right, to acknowledge that, right, as this one response to our survey said, right, that as a Black American, I feel an internal pride gazing upon every brick, every pillar, right? Now, along with collecting aspirations and hearing about desired meanings and experiences and the stories that need to be told by the memorial, we also researched Black traditions and spaces of gathering. So as part of our design process, we looked for cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into our design. So we explored, for example, ring shouts, which is a low country ecstatic dance whose performers move in a circle and whose rhythms and movement connect to West African practices. So circular forms like the ring shout, broken shackle, became very relevant references for us. Okay. So here you could see this juxtaposition of the memorial on the lower half of the image to the left, and then there's the rotunda on the upper part of the image, right? And so we cite the memorial in dialogue with the rotunda. Both are 80 feet in diameter. Now the rotunda sits at that high point, right? Because it's terraced up. Jefferson deliberately placed it on a ridgeline upon a hill. Now that careful terracing of the lawn really works actually in section. And this allowed Jefferson to create pavilions that were 2 stories on the lawn, which was that image, that engraving that I showed you. But actually on the back side of the pavilion, there are 3 stories on the garden side. And that created a lower level walkout basement, which housed spaces where the enslaved labored, right? So the spaces behind the pavilions, enclosed by these famous 1 brick thick serpentine walls, were not these gardens that you see today. They were actually work yards. They're much taller. The walls were actually taller than what we see today. And this is where the enslaved labored. They chopped wood, they hauled water, clothing was being washed. This is where animals were being slaughtered, right? And so in many ways, Jefferson hid it. Jefferson understood slavery to be abhorrent, and he employed architecture, particularly the architectural section, to conceal it. He does exactly the same thing at Monticello, where he also hides the dependencies below. So you have this kind of incredible vista, right, same at UVA, right, of the so-called, pastoral, landscape or wilderness beyond. So our memorial, in contrast, right, instead of closing down to hide, works to reveal, open, and invite. And we utilize this section at our site to create an open, like, bowl figure, right, in contrast to the closed sphere of the rotunda. You see this in this aerial view. The memorial is actually oriented northward. It's oriented toward that direction of freedom, and that path of flight lays out a step, 48 to be exact, for each year that enslaved peoples lived and worked at UVA. Now here you see a diagram of the various parts. The memorial is a series of nested rings fabricated by Virginia mist granite from a nearby quarry in a town called Culpeper. Virginia mist is great because it has a range. It could go very, very dark to almost black, and also out to a light gray. So it's a very malleable granite that then allowed for a range of expressions, right, in the materiality. So the center of the memorial is that gathering space for learning, for performance, and also for activism. This is what we heard from the students, which is inscribed by an inner ring which holds a timeline of historical events. Next layer out is a ring that creates a concave surface of remembrance of names. And then that outer convex surface creates a kind of canvas for expression. And each of these rings speaks to a different layer of history, of meaning, and of interpretation. Now, to develop layers of history, we work closely with an amazing group of committed historians, and their thoughtful examination of UVA's enslaved community provided incredible rich material. We were told in those community engagements that we had to name the names, right? We had to tell the story of the enslaved community. And to do so required that we engage in an archive of work ledgers and personal letters, right? The numbers and ciphers that Saidiya talks about of slave owners. And as such, it is an archive of daily life, but one laced with silences, with things we don't hear, but also with violence. Now, the historians estimate that about 4,000 men, women, and children built, labored, and lived at UVA in that period from 1817 to 65. But we know very little about the details of their lives. But we recognize all of them with memory marks, which are arrayed across the inner arc of the memorial. And that was a challenge, like what to do with what we called in our design process, the unknown unknowns, right? So for most, 3,111 persons to be exact, the archives do not record a name, a first name, or a last name, right? Those are the unknown unknowns. Now, as the spreadsheet on the right shows, we have records for 889 persons. Of those 889 references, we know mostly the first names of 577 community members. For a handful of people, like Isabella Gibbons, Thrimston Hearn, Sally Cottrell, or Henry Martin, we do know a first and last name. But for 311 recorded persons, right, like Three Hands Hired, like I showed you know on that slide previously, we used kinship, relationships, and occupation to remember their lives. So as you walk into the memorial, you become enveloped by what we call a kind of genealogical cloud of names, of marks, and of relationships. And so the traditional features of Western memorials are names, right? Names and dates. But given our archive, we had to reimagine social relations and rehumanize the experiences of the enslaved. And so, as a result, visitors engage Henry and Isabella Gibbons and Jane, Jack, Robert, and Randall as families of sisters, grandmothers, uncles, and friends, and as workers who took pride in their work, as woodcutters, janitors, laundresses, and fiddlers. Carved into the granite are these 4,000 memory marks that speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us. Now, the community names appear across from a bench with a timeline and a water feature that captures the attentions of visitors who learn a very different history of the university. And so in contrast to the wall of marks and names, which rises and inclines outward, a shallow, near-level water table shares with visitors the history of enslavement at the university. Now, 70 historical entries are inscribed into the water table, beginning with the arrival of the enslaved to Virginia in 1619, and it ends with the passing of Isabella Gibbons in 1890. The timeline covers, for example, the arrival of 10 enslaved laborers to clear the land that would become UVA in 1817, and it covers a history of transactions and work and violence. Now, as you see on the right, a steady stream of shallow water washes over the entire arc of the timeline, and we thought that we could use this to reference libation rituals, right, like baptism and these things that recall connections back to Western Africa, but also the currents of rivers that actually carried people to freedom. So you see here two of the entries. So for example, 1826-29, Thrimston's Hearn, quote, a tolerable good stonecutter, end quote, does stonework at UVA, including completing the rotunda steps. 1850, 3 students attack a 12-year-old enslaved girl in a field near UVA. The students are expelled. Now, Isabella Gibbons, a teacher and founder of the Freedmen's School, is the only member of the enslaved community from which the archives actually have yielded a full name, a date of death. We have a photograph of her, and a brief written record of her experiences that were published in the Freedom Recorder in 1867. She serves as a witness for her community, and this is what she remembers, quote, "Can we bear the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from his mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten that by those horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race has been killed? No, we have not. or ever will, end quote. Now, it's her remembrance that concludes this historical timeline. Now, Etta Ochitigbe, Brooklyn-based artist, became part of the team, and just this amazing piece on the exterior. He became interested in layering the information we had gleaned from conversations and historical sites and archives, such as the rare photographs of people enslaved by UVA, and things like, as you see on the right, the rough tombstones from the Daughter of Zion African-American burial ground in Charlottesville, or things like vertical quarry marks and stones that would have been worked by skilled masons like Princeton Hearn. We're looking at a close-up of the eyes of Isabella Gibbons. The original image is, interestingly enough, in the archives of the Boston Public Library. This might be in part because she was enslaved by UVA's mathematics professor William Barton Rogers, who would leave Boston to found MIT. So she may have sent. She remains at UVA, and she becomes enslaved by the next person, the next professor who lives in the Pavilion 6, I believe, is where she was enslaved. But it's interesting that her image ends up in Boston Public Library. So, to realize this idea that Etta had, and it's based on some of his own artwork, which is quite fascinating. So we wanted to realize a relief image of her eyes in the granite. And so Etta, working with the team of the design team, had to develop a unique process and customized software with our fabricator, Cora Stone, who is based in Madison, Wisconsin. The intensity of the data was translated from a photograph, then to a virtual model. Then it was a machine tool path that generated a virtual surface that was then overlaid onto a digital model of the memorial's curved surface. So it was very complicated, precisely because this is a parabolic form and it was a flattened image. Now, all of this took place digitally, working with remote teams, including an amazing group at the UVA's Office of Architect, Alice Rauscher and her team, and our fantastic contractor, Team Henry, that's based in Richmond. So we worked with them before we did anything, and this was cut into stone. And you could see in the image, the way there's this kind of vertical lenticular image that gets overlaid on a kind of bush-hammered pattern like that tombstone, and those two things come together. And this is essentially what it looks like, right? And so these are Isabella Gibbons' eyes, which is visible to the public on the exterior of the public surface. Now, she appears and she disappears, right? So depending on the time of day, how you approach it, how the sun hits it, you can see her eyes. Sometimes you don't. You just see the vertical lines and the bush hammering, right? So her eyes are symbolic of all of those who were enslaved and their descendants, who continue to witness the social transformations in the fight against anti-Black racism. Days after the construction fence at the memorial was removed in the June of 2020, we couldn't have a dedication for the memorial in April of 2020 because of COVID. So they continued to work, they put the sod down, and literally day after this happened, UVA's medical school's White Coats for Black Lives organized a protest. And the group took a knee for 8 minutes and 49 seconds in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd, a gruesome reminder of the violence and injustices that persist in the wake of slavery. The memorial for enslaved laborers at UVA came into fruition through a collective desire to face the past. Another community that was made visible through this collective reckoning was a group claiming kinship to the enslaved community, and this is that group of descendants. And we see here their reunion with their ancestors who lived, worked, and died on the grounds of UVA. That connection between descendants and ancestors, those Black neighborhoods and communities in Charlottesville and the university is only beginning, not only of remembrance, but also of accountability to reckon with the truths, including the horrible cruelties, as the given quote on the timeline reminds us. Now, another theme I've been interested in is mobility. And so this project, Marching On, really explores how Black peoples have taken to the streets regardless of efforts to curtail mobility. And so it's marching on the politics of performance, and it explores histories, the driving forces, and the legacy of marching and organized forms of performance. This piece was commissioned by Storefront in Art and Architecture in 2017, and I worked with architect and my GSAP colleague, the amazing Bryony Roberts. And so we did a research project, performance, and exhibition that explores the role of the community's collective movement, both as acts of cultural expression and as political resistance. Now, our collaborators in this effort was a youth performance group known as the Marching Cobras of New York City. It's a Harlem-based after-school drumline and dance team that continues the traditions of earlier parades and draws heavily from the theatrical flair and history of the historically Black colleges and universities, alongside the beats and choreography of hip hop. Now, with the Marching Cobras, as you can see here in the left, this is the spring of 2017, we explored with them, many of whom were unfamiliar with the origins of their art form of marching. And so we talked about that, and they asked us difficult questions like, what is lynching? And with us, they shared stories about why they joined the Cobras, with many starting as early as age 6 or 7 and remaining with the group into their early 20s. And so the Cobras offered many of them a creative medium that challenged the criminalization of Black youth in public space. And we worked closely with the Cobras' Kevin Young, who's a choreographer, and Terrell Stowers, who's the founding director. Now, we shared with them 2 important marches in the city. The history of the 1917 Silent March against racial violence that was organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, in part, with references also to the revered Harlem Hellfighters. This is the image on the right, which is a Black unit that fought nobly alongside French troops in World War I when racist American troops refused their aid. And their talented musicians like James Rouse actually brought jazz to Europe. And when they returned home to a country who still saw them as less than human, except in the streets of New York, where they marched to a crowd of millions in 1919. So the Silent March and the Harlem Hellfighters were 2 marches that helped really us think about our collaboration. But we also showed how and why Black people took to the streets and to be in public and implicit, oftentimes, protests against anti-Black racism and white supremacy. But we also discussed with the Marching Cobras how marching paid tribute to the exuberance of drum lines from back in the day and the marching bands, as you could see in the right, like Florida A&M at HBCUs. We collaborated with the Marching Cobras to develop an opening sequence of the performance of tight linear formations that echoed historical strides and cadence. And we rehearsed with them traditional steps and drills. And this was a new experience for them, but one that delved into the history of this art form and its connection to political protests. So we see them in Marcus Garvey Park. And this is Brian A., as you can see on the right, working with one of our drummers, Isaiah. And so the drummers actually represented the Hellfighters, and they wore olive shirts and pants that referenced the uniforms of World War I. And the dancers, in contrast, all wore white, alluding to the women who walked in the silent parade, wearing either white blouses, skirts, or pants. Now, Black communities forged public presence in places like Harlem's Marcus Garvey Park, where the longest standing institution has been its Sunday Drum Circle, which anyone can join or observe. But rapid gentrification of Harlem has brought noise complaints from new residents, particularly about the drum circle. So Marching On called attention to this community history and the importance of the performance as a means of claiming public space in transitioning and contentious site. So we presented Marcus Garvey in the park in 2017 as part of Performa 17, which is an international performance biennial that happens in New York City. And needless to say, we made a lot of noise. So I just want to play a short clip of the performance. that gives you a sense of the performance. And so 4 months after that performance, we opened an exhibition at Storefront that presented marching on historical material, all the archival work that we did that provided a basis for the performance. And so you can get a sense of what that looked like. Again, this is actually in Storefront for Art and Architecture in Manhattan. We hung photographer Jenica Heiselman's portraits of the costume cobras in the park to draw out their individual unique characters and that comprise the act and deliberate and celebration of Black youth's talent and aspirations. And for the exhibition's opening, the Cobras actually performed to a rousing crowd of over 100 spectators on the Lower East Side narrow Kinnear Street, which is in front of Storefront. And the Cobras, drummers, and dancers performed again this time without a legal permit, because once again the neighborhood resisted these sounds. But we took to the streets and marched on, Black and proud. So the last theme I just want to explore briefly is unbuilding. So back in February, actually, of 2020, the exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness opened at the Museum of Modern Art. I co-curated it with Sean Anderson, who at the time was an associate curator, along with our curatorial assistants, Ariel Dion-Krosnick and Anna Burkhart. Because Reconstructions explores Blackness and anti-Black racism in its curatorial ethic, it not only challenges the disciplinary practices, but also MoMA's own institutional histories. We were very interested in how anti-Black racism shows how white supremacy and its legacy shapes the built environment, as seen in these HOLC maps of Queens in the 30s that then get used for redlining in New York City. So this is the area known as Elmhurst Queens. And so, this is on the front and the back matter of the catalog. These were drawings done by Studio And then we could see how this impoverishment, the legacy of that impoverishment, is an imprint of the spatial, architectural, and urban inequity by design that can be seen in the overlay of the COVID map, right? Notice that concentration is in that same area of grade D, in the red area, right? And so this is produced in our field guide. So yet amidst the degradation of anti-Black racism, nonetheless, Black peoples found and made spaces of beauty, dignity, and joy. And we always love to refer to this Gordon Parks photograph of a department store and the woman and her daughter, right? And the ways in which their pictorial expression, right, in the face of such exclusion. Reconstructions, 11 architects, designers, and artists created projects exploring Blackness, but also the legacies, like, seen here in that image in the map of anti-Black racism in cities and towns around the U.S., right? And this map, which was on one of the walls of the galleries, juxtaposes the all-Black towns that were settled after the Civil War with the sites by our 11 contributors. We asked them all to think about scales of the body, of the kitchen, of the room, the house, the neighborhood, of the planet, of the club, of worship, all along with spaces of remembrance, of beauty, cultivation, knowledge, liberation, in 10 sites around the U.S. So New York City, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Nashville, Syracuse, Oakland, Kinloch, Missouri, near St. Louis, Atlanta, and Miami. And here is what emerged.
It's been really hard for brown and Black people to imagine a future in this country.
It's been a real challenge because Black people in America are not given the space to even just be.
In order then to think about possible futures, somehow we have to reimagine ourselves in new places and then find ways to get there.
We're not just interrogating America's history with Blackness, we're interrogating architecture's history with Blackness.
All right. And so this is just a little bit of some of the projects. Mario Gooden's his Space of Refusal, his protest machine, for Nashville. I think you guys probably saw this because Felicia came last semester. Her responsive textiles, fabricated networks in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. And in the right, you could see David Hart, who's an artist, on his Exactitude of Science Watts. And in the background is Amanda Williams, We're Not Down There, We're Over Here. That's about Kinloch, Missouri. Here's a close-up of that, and her space capsule ship that she fabricated. Lake Geophysis, The Frozen Neighborhoods, his Afrofuturistic meditation on Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Seen here, your own amazing Sekou Cooks, We Out Ya, Rebuilding Syracuse. Jermaine Barnes, Spectrum of Miami, Spectrum of Blackness, based in Miami, and you see the spice racks of the different kinds of blackness from the Caribbean, from Latin America, but also from the United States. Here is Walter Hood's work on Towers of Power, and this amazing work by Emmanuel Admasu called Immeasurability about Atlanta. The 10 of the group formed a collective, and so the Black Reconstruction Collective, which was really amazing, and to hang out of outside of the gallery, forming a threshold of the exhibition, is their Powerful, which is a 10 by 10 foot manifesting statement that commits, as they write, to, quote, continuing this work of reconstruction in Black America, quote. And so this is just a couple of images from the exhibition that was up for 3 months. It was an amazing show. The galleries were always full, even though there was, at least for most of the show, 30% capacity at MoMA. And so this was just Blackness in all of its beauty. And so that's where I want to end. And thank you all.
Wow. Don't know quite what to say, but we'll just transition into the discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Wilson. I'll hand it next to Professor Monash.
Hey, everybody. Mabel, thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation about your really interesting and really important work. I think everybody here knows me, but if you don't, I'm the Associate Director of the School of Architecture. I'm also an architectural historian interested in identity and a longtime follower and fan of Mabel Wilson's work. So I'm delighted to be tasked with leading the question and answer session. So I'll be monitoring the chat. If people want to write in questions, we'll try and bring them in. But I've also invited 3 of our students to join me in this, this discussion. All 3 are familiar with Mabel Wilson's work and have been involved in memorial and exhibition projects with me and others at the School of Architecture. I'm going to immediately turn it over to them. Let's start with Jasir, who has a great question for Mabel.
Hi, Dr. Wilson. Thank you so much for coming and giving such a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask, because I noticed, and also I watched some of your other lectures, but you often mention your Uncle John and sort of this idea of home places, which you talked about in this presentation as well. So I guess my main question is, like, as we think about, how gentrification and, displacement has affected Black and Brown communities historically, could you kind of go more into this importance of the idea of home places and how they define Black vernacular architecture and going forward?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jasir, for that really great question. I started to think about the idea of home places when I wrote a piece. Well, one, it was just a conversation with my uncle that we published, and I wrote a piece for a catalog on a show that was at Project Row House many years ago. And it kind of been thinking about, kind of what, how does life sediment in these kind of spaces? And there's actually a beautiful piece in the catalog, Reconstructions, written by the poet Tanya Foster, about her grandmother's house in New Orleans, actually. And it completely captures the kind of range of associations of everyday life, of things that you don't notice, but that are there, that are building these histories. And, they're ephemeral. They're not, Lonnie Bunch has this amazing, way. He always says, that oftentimes Black history is just hiding in plain sight. We just don't see it, which is true certainly at UVA. And so the project of the museum and the archive, as kind of Western sites to collect, were not the sites that were collecting Black history and culture, right? Because for various reasons, it was believed if you were Black or you were African, you didn't have history. It's Hegel, blah, blah, blah. Long conversation about that. But where is past being made? Like, where does past sediment? How do we know these how do we know or understand the past? Because there are many different ways of understanding that past, and one of them can be these kind of domestic sites. And so for me, it was just a way of kind of recognizing them, but also recognizing, the spaces of Black women, like my mom, my grandmothers, and where they were, and how to bring that into my own work, because, that was just something that just was never mentioned, right? The spaces of women. And that was a, kind of a conversation a while back about, how do we start to think about questions of domesticity in architecture. And you're right to kind of bring up the vulnerability, right, of Black communities. I mean, that was another thread that was clear in Reconstructions and almost everyone's project about, gentrification and redevelopment, and the ways, and also just the legacies of urban renewal and redlining, and the way that both builds ghettos and isolates, but also, because of the ways in which it produced devalued property, that property became very, very valuable, let's say in the 60s and 70s, with efforts, right, to then redevelop cities, right? And that is basically fueling, the gentrification and pushing people again into other areas. So, so there's, these kind of complicated arrange or constellations of images, of issues, I think, relative. So.
Yeah, thank you. Masai has a related question about time and space and memory.
Thank you for speaking with us and sharing your inspiring works. You spoke today and on your previous talks about how it's hard to bring old narrative into current works, because it's a journey that changed both worlds. And I found this really my pronunciation, provocating, that even though time is moved and we are moving with it and changing with it, the question of identity, who you are and where we're from, stays the same. So my question is, as architects, how do you think we can answer the question and allow for people to go back and forth with past and present?
Yeah, good question, especially around identity. I think there's a way in which, we tend to think of time in a line. There's the past, there's the present, and then there's this thing called the future. And that really gets ingrained into thinking in the 19th century, right? And so there are groups of people who are going to lead civilization forward, and then there are the people who are backward, right? And that gets folded into ideas of progress, right? And one of my favorite, I teach our survey class, so I teach kind of the long 19th century in one section of the survey, and there's this painting by Gast, I think it's William Gast, of Progress. And it shows this exact same figure of liberty that I showed, and she's floating across America, bringing, she's got a book, a primer, I think, and she's threading the telegraph wires across the continent. And then you see indigenous people running, into the darkness as the light of civilization is coming forward. And I think that is the narrative that then gets set up, right? They're the dying degenerative race of people, as white settler colonialism takes over. And in the background, you could see New York City, the Brooklyn Bridge, right? You see architecture representing progress and the infrastructures, right, of settlement happening, right? But I think that's one framework that's the West framework of temporality. There are other ways of understanding time in the world, right? and even in the West, there are just many different ways in which people were trying to, well, what is the past? You could read people like Bergson, right? To think about, like, how's the past unfold into the present? What is memory in relationship to history? Apparently the Incans had in Peru, there was a sense of, you were only ever in the present. The past was unfolding simultaneously in the present, as was the future. And it was all happening simultaneously. That's one way of understanding time, which I actually think is amazing. And so I think it's complicated, and we have to think about what are the discourses, right? And modes of representation. Like how, I always tell my students, think about the ways in which clocks work and how time is literally parceled and cut up to seconds and minutes and hours and months and years. That is a kind of enclosure of time, where sometimes we experience time very quickly. Sometimes time is very slow. So, how we start to situate ourselves in that moment is complicated. And also with identity, we are many, many, many identities, and those identities are not stable. They are constantly shifting and changing, and and what it means to be one identity, is always, fluctuating. And so, I think time and space and how we think about those things together are really powerful. One of the things that I turned to do that, actually very early on, wasn't just art, is also film and video, because it's a temporal medium that also can work spatially. So, but thank you. That's a really, really interesting question.
Yeah, and Jess has a similar question about this theme and the role of architects specifically in it. Jess?
Yes, so first and foremost, I'd like to just say thank you, and I really appreciate your time and coming to speak with us today to share your works and your involvement in the field. And I have great respect for the work you've done and the stories you seek to unfold for learning and healing within not just the African American community, but with us all as a society. So my question is, in terms of monuments and memorials that seek to honor and pay respect to the past events of our country and its history of slavery, what do you think we can do individually and as a community to ensure there is ongoing learning, which fosters healing and not forgetting? And what do you think we can do as an architecture community to better aid in this process?
Wow. That's hard. Wow, what can we do? I mean, that's a big question. I mean, and maybe this doesn't, not everybody would agree, but it's been interesting. I never thought I would become a historian. I am a historian by default. My PhD is in American Studies. I'm actually not an architectural historian. By training, though, I teach architectural history. But the more I learn about American history, the more I feel like I wish people would learn about American history, because it's complicated. It's so fascinating and complicated. And it's not really American history, it's world history, and we have to understand what world history means. But I feel like there's a way in which Americans, and maybe it's the time in which the nation was born and how it constructed its narrative of its forming, chooses to sometimes maybe forget the violence that was inherent in its own birth, and not just the Revolutionary War, but at the ground, to understand what does it mean to come and take land from somebody else, indigenous dispossession, which didn't just happen in the Americas. I mean, it happens as Europe expands outward into Asia, into Africa, and also into the New World. And it's a long, long process of how that happens. But in the United States, it's a very particular incremental history of, pushing and taking and pushing and taking and pushing and taking. And we have to recognize what that meant and what that did and what that does. And who were those identities? Those are some of my ancestors. My North Carolina ancestors are European and they are African. And I have figured out who some of those people are. And what that means is very, very complicated. And again, what did it mean to take peoples of African descent from the continent, bring them to the New World? I don't know, like my ancestors in Eastern North Carolina, whether they were coming from the Caribbean or directly from Africa. I have no way of knowing, that history. I've located some of them back to the 18th century, which is unusual, but I don't know beyond that where they came from. The English, the Europeans, I've been able to, through just tracing stuff, go back to the 12th century, which is but that's baptismal records, right? So reckoning with those histories, which are really painful and complicated, it's important personal work, and I'm glad I'm doing that. I mean, I'm glad I'm trying to figure out what those histories of my family are in North Carolina and Virginia, where they came from, alongside of doing the historical work and the design work, because it kind of gives me a sense of then, how we came into being. And it's difficult. It's difficult for Black folks, it's difficult for white folks and everyone else as well, because it's not pretty. It's just not a pretty history. But that's okay. I know it and I understand it, right? And that makes maybe more appreciative of this project of a democratic nation. And what does that mean to be a citizen and to have responsibilities? It makes me appreciate the possibility of that even more so. But it's work to do it, and if we don't drop, the mythologies and really deal with the truths, then, I don't know how we can go forward. And it's hard. It's hard truth. I think they were right when they told us we had to tell the unvarnished truth. But we don't just need to do that to our communities. We can also do that at a personal level to understand those histories, which are entangled and complicated. Nobody has a rosy, background. So I would say it's a personal commitment, but you also, by doing so, commit yourself to maybe a larger civic engagement and a larger conversation with your community, even if it's an academic community as well.
Yeah, we only have a few more minutes, but we have a few more specific questions instead of broad questions. One that has come in the chat about the MoMA Black Reconstructions exhibit, and maybe if you could elaborate a little on the history of MoMA as an institution with engaging with non-white exhibitions and so on, that gave pause to the contributors and the curators, and about participation and how you overcame and addressed that in the work. Felicia Davis alluded to this when she spoke with us as well, so we're curious to hear your thoughts. You're still muted.
Yeah, that goes back. I'll drop something in the chat that might be, if I can find it really quickly, that will explain a little bit more. Here we go. So hopefully I can share this with everyone. Everybody's interested in what I'm going to talk about. So anyway, Sean Anderson really wanted to do this show about kind of race in the built environment, and we started a conversation somewhere around 2016 maybe, about doing an exhibition. And at the same time, I was approached by Darby English, who's an art historian at University of Chicago, who's kind of a curator at large at MoMA. And MoMA, with its new edition, it's kind of expansion, and MoMA has its own complicated, like the ways in which it functions as an institution. But it expanded because it recognized, finally, that what constitutes a modern art, design, film, photography practice is much broader than Picasso and Pollock. And they, their collection and the ways in which they wanted to show their work, they wanted to expand. So Darby and Charlotte Barat took on this project called, among others, Blackness at MoMA. And they asked different scholars to look at a piece of work in the collection around the question of blackness. It didn't mean it had to be by a Black person, it just meant it had to address blackness in some fashion. Film, and got amazing stuff from all these departments. So they go to architecture. Like, okay, what do you have in your department around blackness, or just by Black architects, designers, whatever? And MoMA is the first department collecting modern design and architecture, right? Founded by Philip Johnson and Alfred Barr, right? It has this amazing study. It's got, it's the international style show. That's one of the first books I got when I was a student at UVA, my first year in first year in architecture, right? Seminal, right? So they got the collection. What do they find? Zero, nothing. And they look and they look and they look and they're like, no, can't find anything. But they do find a piece of fabric by a designer, Joel Robinson, in their study collection. The study collection is stuff that they put for study so scholars can come in, but it's not in the official collection of the museum. So they found this fabric by Joel Robinson. That was it. And so they approached me to say, we're writing this incredibly long essay for the beginning. Everybody else is writing these short pieces. Can you write an essay explaining why there is this absence in this archive, right? And that became an important reason to kind of do the show. It's like, so why is Blackness absent from this archive of modern architecture? That's so important. So I wrote this essay, White by Design, that I dropped in the chat. And then, you know, that really became a way of basically leveraging, like, and this is why, MoMA, you need to do the show. And so, you know, we started the show, we started to pull it together, but then there's always this kind of spectrum of Philip Johnson's own legacy as an American Nazi. And, you know, that was also kind of part of, you know, kind of the conversations around the show and how to kind of engage kind of with an institution and a department that had that history. So needless to say, it was a very, very complicated project. But I would say curatorially, the way we worked, which is very much the same way we worked with the museum, with the memorial, was that we came in dialogue. We put together, because the archive was empty, to tell Sean, we put together a human archive. We had an amazing advisory group of people, Diane Harris, Milton Curry, Justin Moore, Sherlyn Eiffel, I think, came from one of our first, the guy who wrote The Color of Law, I can't remember his name, he did an amazing book on redlining, Christina Sharp, really a remarkable group of people, Steve Nelson, who's the dean at CASVA, Thelma Golden, head of the Studio Museum setting, Kevin Young, who is at the Schomburg, who's now running the African American, I mean, all these people kind of came in and were part of the conversation for, like, all right, how do we think this project, because it's a complicated one, filled with, you know, landmines and, you know, things. So to really strategically kind of navigate how this project was going to unfold, right? And I think the thing that I'm really proud of, there are three things. One is our field guide, which is still out there, that really, you know, just has an amazing array of essays and articles and work from our contributors, you know, which is phenomenal. The other aspect is the Black Reconstructions Collective, that a group emerged that is going to continue the work of the exhibition. Because we're concerned, like, well, we can do this exhibition, but what's its impact going to be? That's why we did it. We didn't care necessarily about, like, what was stuck on the wall, but how are we going to be impactful? And the third thing is that there is an online course on Coursera that is worth looking at, that we worked with MoMA to produce. And that is also important. And, you know, I know friends who, you know, my friend at Duke, blank on Paul's last name, Jascott, is using it for his class. Another friend that teaches at Brown in poetry, she's using it in her class. So it's nice that that Coursera course, you know, becomes a kind of afterlife for the exhibition, you know, and, you know, the conversation continues. So that's along about, you know, just understanding the institutional context, right? It was a complicated institutional context at UVA as well. So thinking about how, and oftentimes it isn't one thing, it's many things, you know, and it doesn't happen all at once. It literally takes years to get institutions to shift. But, you know, it's work. And to boot, just to remind folks that at UVA, it was students who did that work. Students were the ones that held the university accountable throughout the aughts to make the university explore its history of slavery. It wasn't that the president, I got this idea, it was students. So you guys have a lot of power and really, really, really should use it for good.
Well, I think that's a powerful spot to conclude, especially as we're over time. And I want to be respectful of your time because we're so appreciative that you made time for us today. And I know that we all really learned and enjoyed listening and learning from you. And just thanks so much. And thanks, Jasir, Jess, and Masai for joining me and for participating in this discussion.
Thanks, Emily. Wow, this has been such an incredible afternoon. I'll just share some parting thoughts, primarily intended for our students, just thinking about how I might have come away from this lecture, but also thinking with a few years of experience, how I might suggest that you spend the afternoon kind of in thought and reflection about this wonderful lecture. I can't help but note, for example, how seamlessly and fluidly Mabel Wilson operates between roles as a historian, a designer, an artist and curator, an educator and practitioner, for example. I love your freedom and fearlessness, not only to pursue a cause of racial justice, but also to adopt these multiple and diverse disciplinary modalities. I mean, there's also a lot, I have to say, of kind of fear of trying on the other shoe, right? Or trying that new skill or that new action or practice. And I love that fearlessness that you represent. Literature, memorial design, archival research, textiles, musical performance, exhibition curation, right? And the fact that you operate so well, not only as an independent scholar designer, but also as one who collaborates, right? Those are also, sometimes in architecture, we struggle to do both well. So I come away thinking about this kind of representing a new model of a kind of critical practitioner scholar, a truth teller, a culture and knowledge shaper, in addition to shaping the built environment, shaping knowledge itself, how we understand our place in the world, especially in light of the untold stories that need to be told. And is that not the ultimate legacy one could wish for? So I'm inspired and awed, and I really appreciate your time with us today, Mabel Wilson, and want to thank faculty and students and staff and friends of the school who joined us. And Greer, thank you so much. This is Greer's last day with the school, but not the last day in our community. We'll still see you on campus. And thanks to everyone. Have an inspired afternoon and weekend.